Judges chapter 6. And it's going to be a little bit different today because we're having a little technical difficulty. So you won't have slides today. So we'll have more of a conversation, it seems. But Judges chapter 6. So we're in our fourth lesson here in Portraits of Grace. We'll be talking this week about Gideon, and we'll start out actually reading a little bit of Gideon. There's actually going to be three kind of focuses for Gideon. This is the broad portrait of grace for Gideon is that he was, it was grace to build faith is the title of today's. And we'll see that Gideon was given grace as a humble man, as an obedient man, and as a faithful man. And we'll look through those three aspects today. Judges chapter 6, it says, "And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord delivered them in the hands of Midian 7 years. And the hand of Midian prevailed against Israel, and because of the Midianites, the children of Israel made them dens, which are in the mountains and the caves and the strongholds. And so it was that Israel had sown, that Midian came up, and the Amalekites and the children of the east, even they came up against them, and they encamped against them and destroyed the increase of the earth, till thou come into Gaza, and left no sustenance for Israel, neither sheep, nor ox, nor ass. For they came up with their cattle and their tents, and they came as grasshoppers for multitude, for both they and their camels were without number, and they entered into the land to destroy it." It says, "And Israel was greatly impoverished because of the Midianites, and the children of Israel cried unto the Lord." So this is the situation we see that Israel is facing. And we see it's the Midianites are the ones that have come up, that have visited. And the concern is, we'll see a little bit about the response and the situation that Gideon was sitting in. But who are the Midianites? Anybody know? Who are the Midianites? They're the bad guy in the story, right? That's usually when we read this story, we're like, oh, they're the bad guys in the story. They're just evil. They just came and they brought all their friends, the Amalekites and the children of the east, and they've just ravished Israel, and they've taken over all their lands. They've taken over their fields and their cattle and everything. But there's a little bit of backstory we need to know to understand where Gideon is with the Midianites and Israel. So actually go back to Genesis. The Midianites didn't just show up. And this is a little bit that was an aha for me, that we often read the Old Testament stories and we read these names of the peoples that are there. We just assume these are just bad people, and they were not good people. They did bad things. But in Genesis chapter 25, we see the connection here is actually really much closer between Midian and Israel than we may realize. And actually in verse 24, last verse of 24, just to give you kind of timing of where this is, it says, "And Isaac brought," he's talking about Rebekah, Rebekah, into his mother Sarah's tent, and took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her, and Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. So this is after Sarah had passed away. It says in verse 25, "Then again Abraham took a wife, and her name was Keturah, and she bare him Zimram, and Zokshan, and Midian, and Ishbak, and Shua." Is there a name in there you recognize? Midian. So who was Midian? Let's say, who was Midian to Isaac? Would have been a half brother, right? So we see Midian. This is Abraham's second wife. So after Sarah, Abraham took another wife, Keturah, and had some children, and one of them was Midian. And it says, "And Joshcam begat Sheba and Dedan, and the sons of Dedan were Ashurim and Letushim and Lemuel." And we'll skip down because I'm not going to keep saying all these names. It says, "And Abraham gave all that he had," in verse 5, "unto Isaac, but unto the sons of the concubines which Abraham had, and Abraham gave gifts and sent them away from Isaac his son, while he yet lived eastward unto the east country." And so what happened to the sons of Keturah? What did they get in the situation? It says Abraham gave him what? Gave him gifts and sent them away. So all the stuff, all the blessing that Abraham had, he gave to who? He gave to Isaac, right? And he sent the sons of Keturah away. And it says, and so Isaac lived eastward into the east country, and then the others went southward and southwestern country. And so the area of Midian that we talk about is around the Gulf of Aqaba. Some believe it's in the Sinai Peninsula that sits between Egypt and Israel, and some believe it's on the side of Saudi Arabia on the Gulf of Aqaba. But that's where the Midians were. So they were kind of southeast of Israel. And so we see there, it says in verse 7, we're going to read down because I think it's interesting to understand the family dynamics that are here. It says, "And these are the days and years of Abraham's life, which he lived, and 115 years. Then Abraham gave up his ghost and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. And his sons, Isaac and Ishmael, buried him in the cave of Machpelah, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, which is before Mamre. The field which Abraham purchased the sons of Heth, there was Abraham buried, and Sarah his wife." It's interesting. Look back in verse 9, beginning of verse 9. Who buried Abraham? His sons. But who were his sons that buried him? Isaac and Ishmael. It's interesting. We see who came back to bury his father. Ishmael. We look at this family. This family wasn't just Isaac and Ishmael. This family included all those people named in verse 2 as well, right? But verse 2, that dynamic that was set up between Abraham and Isaac and Ishmael and all the other sons was not a happy family, it sounds like. They weren't all on the same page of what the future was for Abraham's lineage. And so we see Ishmael comes back. Remember, Ishmael was sent away. Him and his mother were sent away, but Ishmael comes back with Isaac to bury his father. So you start to see that this is not an easy, simple Midian was bad and Israel was good. There's a lot of family drama that set up what we will see in Judges. Go ahead and turn to Exodus chapter 2, and we'll see Midian mentioned again. We'll see that there's actually even a closer relationship between Midian and Israel than we may realize. Exodus chapter 2, and looking down in verse 16. We know that Moses, this is this kind of the backstory or the beginning story of Moses, and Moses growing up in Pharaoh's house. What did Moses do? What was the crime that Moses committed? The crime that he did in Pharaoh's house. What happened that made him leave? He slew an Egyptian, right? He was protecting a slave, and he slew an Egyptian, and he took off. And in verse 15, we see, "Now when Pharaoh heard this, he sought to slay Moses, but Moses fled away from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of" where? Midian. "And he sat down by a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs of water filled the troughs to water their father's flock." And we know that kind of what continues on in this story. Who does Moses end up marrying? One of those daughters, the priest of Midian. Who was the priest of Midian? Well, down further, they call him Reuel first in verse 18. When we learn later, his other name is in chapter 3, verse 1. It says, "Now Moses kept the flocks of Jethro." So Zipporah was one of those 7 daughters. And she was a Midianite, right? So Moses married a Midianite. And Jethro was what? He wasn't just a commoner among the Midianites. Who was he? In verse 16, what do we see? He was a priest of Midian. Some that's related to, some have translated that or considered that priest the idea of a prince. But he was a leader among the Midianites, whether it was a governmental leader or a religious leader. Jethro was a leader among the Midianites. And so we see Moses, who's his father-in-law now? A Midianite. So the nation of Israel, the leader of the nation of Israel, is now tied to the Midianites. Go ahead and turn to Exodus chapter 18. I know this is a little bit of a rabbit trail, but it helped me understand the context that we were coming into this. So God calls while Moses is feeding the flocks in Midian. Where does God show up? In a bush in Midian, and he calls Moses to go back to Pharaoh and challenge him to let his people go and lead that exodus out of Egypt. So he does that. And as he leads them out of Egypt, and we'll see through we'll read all of it, but through 16 and 17, he leads them out of Egypt. They get water from the rock. Then in verse 18 we see, when Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel his people, and the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt, then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her back. And we can skip down to verse 5. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife unto Moses into the wilderness, where he encamped at the mount of God. Then he said unto Moses, I, thy father-in-law Jethro, am come up unto thee, and thy wife and her 2 sons with her. So here's Jethro coming to visit Moses. Moses has sent his family to Jethro and said, go stay with your father while I go approach the Pharaoh, because I don't know what's going to happen. So he sent his family to stay with Jethro for safety. Jethro comes back and brings his family. Now keep in mind, if we looked at in Genesis, who were the Midianites to Israel? They were family, right? They were relation. These were cousins, right? So this is not distant relation. I mean, in some ways, he's not just going and marrying someone who's from a distant country. These were family. These were not Egyptians. These were Midianites who were of the household of Abraham, and so these are relations. But we see there he says he brought his family back, and we'll read verse 7. Because I think it gives a perspective of who Jethro is and a little bit of the Midianites at the time, this leader of the priest of the Midianites. It says, and Moses went out to meet his father-in-law and did obeisance and kissed him and asked each other of their welfare, and they came into the tent. And Moses told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done unto Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, and all the travail that had come upon them by the way, and how the Lord had delivered them. And Jethro rejoiced for all the goodness which the Lord had done unto Israel, whom they had delivered out of the hand of the Egyptians. And Jethro said, Blessed be the Lord, who hath delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians and out of the hand of Pharaoh, and who hath delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know the Lord is greater than all the gods, for the thing wherein they have dealt proudly, he was above for in the thing wherein he had dealt proudly, he was above them. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and sacrifices for God. Then Abraham came and all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. So we see here Jethro's puts his faith, or at least has, whether he kept the faith of Abraham, we don't know. It doesn't really say what the Midianites, what he was a priest of as the Midianites during that time. But we see he does what? He offers sacrifices to God. He praises God. So we see this leader of the Midianites believes in Jehovah at this point. So this is the stage that we see starting in Exodus 18. We won't read all of it, but further down as we go, and actually Jethro here gives advice to Moses about judging the people. He's like, you need to delegate. You can't judge the people all by yourself. You need some help. So if you want to study in good in-law relationships, Jethro is a good example of what good in-law relationships were. They had a good relationship between him and Moses. He gave him advice. He cared for him. That's a whole other side. We won't have that lesson today. But we see that that's the setup. Later on in Numbers, we won't go there and study all this, but in Numbers we actually see that the Midianites made some not so great friends with the Amalekites and some others in the area. And the Midianites actually tried to plot against Israel. They started to see the blessings that Israel had, and they plotted against Israel. And God actually sent the tribes of Israel to pick out some mighty men and to go against the Midianites. And they actually wiped out all the men in Midian, and they took the women and children back to Israel. Partly because I think they were family. They weren't to wipe them completely out, but they wiped out all the men of Midian. And that happened in Judges later on. Moses led that attack. So we see there's a messy history here between Midian and Israel. That separation from when Abraham sent them away, to the joining of Jethro and Moses, to the attack and where God instructed them to attack Midian. So that leads us up to where we are in Judges. So eventually, between the time of Numbers and Judges, from Moses' time to the time of Gideon, people had settled back in Midian. Midian had developed the people, they started seeing numbers. And we saw in the beginning of chapter 6, Midian also developed some friendships, right? They had some alliances there. As Midian came and prevailed against Israel in Judges 6 and verse 2, we see they also brought with them who? The Amalekites and the children of the east. Amalekites probably saw there was an opportunity there. Hey, Midian's doing pretty well against Israel. Let's go help them out. And we see them come and take over and are in control of Israel. So this is the situation that sets up for where we see Gideon. And we see in verse 7, back in Judges chapter 6, it says, "It came to pass when the children of Israel cried unto the Lord because of the Midianites, that the Lord sent a prophet unto the children of Israel, which said unto them, Thus saith the Lord of Israel, I brought you out of Egypt, and brought you forth out of the house of bondage, and I delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians, and out of the hand of all that oppressed you, and drave them out before you, and gave you their land. And I said unto you, I am the Lord your God. Fear not for the gods of the Amorites in those lands ye dwell, but ye have not obeyed my voice." Now this is the story of the judges, right? Israel goes and they cry out to God. God comes and rescues them, and then they turn around and disobey God, and they become captives again, or they become persecuted again, and then they cry out to God, and then God shows up and reminds them of the things that they've done along the way. And God clearly says here, he says, why were they now facing the challenges they were? Because they had not obeyed his voice. They had turned away from him. And so the Midianites were brought in to persecute them, to discipline them in many ways, chastise them. And so in verse 11, we see, and there came an angel. This is where we see the introduction of Gideon. And it says, "And there came an angel of the Lord, and sat under the oak, which was at Ophrah, and it pertained unto Joash the Abiezrite, and his son Gideon threshed wheat by the winepress to hide it from the Midianites." So first we're going to look at this idea of who Gideon was. He was a humble man. And this first aspect of that humbleness was his selflessness. What was Gideon doing when the angel of the Lord showed up? Threshing wheat. And it says there he was threshing wheat by the winepress. I've never threshed wheat. I've seen it done. But this idea of where a typical threshing floor is usually an open area. And why would it be open? What are you trying to catch when it's open? The wind, right? So it's usually an outside place that was open, a nice rocky kind of flat area where they could beat the wheat. And then as the chaff would go, the chaff would be carried away in the wind. So that's kind of what the action was. But where was he? He was in a wine press. Think about that. So here's Gideon. They don't have cattle. Most of their cattle's been taken away. They don't have really any food. Anytime they grow food, what's happening? The Midianites are coming along and taking it away, carrying it off. So here's Gideon, and he's threshing wheat by the wine press. And the wine press, I had a visual for you, but the wine press had a round circle. You imagine a kind of a hole in the ground and the rock, where they would put the grapes down and they would stomp the grapes. I mean, you've probably seen the big barrel idea, but that's, think of a natural way of that. It wasn't an open area where there was wind. So imagine the work it would take to try to thresh wheat in a wine press. You ever think about that? Like how much extra beating you'd have to do and work, and it wouldn't be the nice clean grain you would get out of it. But Gideon had a priority. What was his priority? Get some bread. He needed to feed his family. We don't see it here, but later on we know Gideon had 60 sons eventually in his life. He had a big family. He had several wives. So Gideon was trying to care for his family through this. He says, and so the angel of the Lord came to him, and he's beating wine. And so we see through the small acts that he's already doing, he's trying to care for his family. We're seeing faithfulness in the small acts that he's doing before even God shows up to visit him. And it says in verse 12, "And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him and said unto him, The Lord is with thee, thou mighty man of valor. And Gideon said unto him, O my Lord, if the Lord be with us, why then is all this befallen us? And where be all his miracles which our fathers told us, saying, Did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord hath forsaken us and delivered us into the hands of the Midianites." So the angel of the Lord says, you're a mighty man. And he says, the Lord is with you. And Gideon responds to him and says, if I'm mighty, why are we fallen to the Midianites? I heard of what God did for us back in Egypt and how he delivered us and he cared for us and did all these miracles. He says in there, did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord hath forsaken us and delivered us into the hand of the Midianites. In some ways we read that and like, man, he's pretty bold to say this to the angel of the Lord. But at this point, Gideon doesn't know it's the angel of the Lord. We'll see that in a minute, that he realizes this as he has the conversation. But really what we see here is Gideon doesn't believe himself to be the man of valor that God is saying that he is. Gideon views himself not as a man of valor, but just as a humble guy trying to get some food for his family. In verse 14, and the Lord looked upon him and said, go in this thy might, and thou shalt save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have not I sent thee? And he said unto him, O my Lord, wherewith shall I save Israel? Behold, my family is poor in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house. See, again, we see his humbleness here, this idea that he's not the one that's going to lead, that can lead an army. And it says, and he said unto him, now, and if now I have found grace in thy sight, then show me a sign that thou talkest with me. It's like he wanted to understand that he really had the power of the Lord on him. And he told the angel of the Lord in verse 18, depart not hence, I pray thee, until I come again and bring forth a present and set it before thee. And he said, I will tarry. The angel of the Lord said, I will tarry until thou come again. And we see in verse 19, we continue to see his selflessness and his submission we'll see his submission later on, but his selflessness in this. And it says, and the angel went in and made ready a kid and unleavened cakes of an ephah of flour, and the flesh he had put in a basket, and he put in the broth in a pot, and he brought it out unto him under the yoke and presented it. So here's Gideon. Don't read over verse 19 too quickly. What's facing the Israel right now when it comes to food? What are they facing right now? They were starving, right? Midianites were starving out the Israelites. They were taking away their food. They took away their cattle. They took away their wheat and their grain. But what's it say there? What did Gideon go and do for the angel of the Lord? He prepared a feast. He made a dinner for him. He didn't just like go and say, well, I'm going to go make a little bit of cake and fry some cornbread up for you and give it to you. He said he did what? He made ready a kid. This is a baby goat. Cooked it. Put some unleavened bread, and put the kid in a basket, made some broth up, probably off what he had cooked, put all that together and brought it out to the angel of the Lord. What does that show? That of Gideon. Shows love, right? He understood hospitality. He cared selflessness. He cared for to show the angel of the Lord, I don't have much, but I will give it to you. It says in verse 20, it says, and the angel of God said unto him, take the flesh and the unleavened cake and lay them on the rock and pour out the broth. And he did so. And the angel of the Lord poured forth the end of his staff that was in his hand and touched the flesh of the unleavened cakes. And there rose up out of the rock and consumed the flesh and unleavened bread. Rose up fire out of the rock, and consumed the flesh and unleavened bread. Then the angel of the Lord departed out of his sight. And when Gideon perceived that he was an angel of the Lord, Gideon said, alas, O Lord God, for because I have seen an angel of the Lord face to face. And the Lord said unto him, peace be unto thee, fear not, thou shalt not die. Then Abraham built an altar there unto the Lord and called it Jehovah Shalom unto this day, is yet an Ophrah of the Izraelites. So we see here that Gideon, that laid out this feast for the angel of the Lord. What did the angel of the Lord do? Stuck out his staff, caught it on fire, and it was consumed. The miracle like we've seen with Elijah when the altar and fire came down, we see this, the angel of the Lord does it there, and then he's gone. It says he disappeared out of the sight. And we see that Gideon realized who he was speaking to, realized who was calling him a man of valor, telling him that he was going to take on the Midianites, and that he was going to lead Israel to peace. And when he perceived that, what did he do? He praised the Lord. We see that Gideon was submissive to who God was. We won't read all the way down, but we see that in verse 25, he gets direction from God to go tear down an altar. He gets his first mission, his first challenge from God. And this is part of building faith of Gideon, to go tear down an altar. And in verse 27, we see, then Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord had said unto him. And so it was, because he feared his father's household, and the men of the city that he could not do it by day, but he did it by night. We see so that Gideon did what? He served God. He obeyed. He was obedient. So we see that God gave Midian and Gideon, they're going to rhyme the whole time, gave Gideon grace as an obedient man. And we see this development of his faith. So the first step was realizing who God was and realizing that God had power to carry him through. And that's what we saw with the meal that had burnt up and opened up Gideon's eyes. And then God gave him a task, a pretty simple task, right? Sounds pretty simple. Go tear down that idol that's sitting in your town. It was actually not just a simple task, but it was a pretty local task, right? It's easy sometimes we think to say, well, God, send me to some foreign country because I don't know anybody. If I mess up, nobody, it's not, but don't send me to my family. Don't send me to go reach my family because that's hard because I got to see them day to day, right? I can go talk to strangers on a plane and a car ride, a taxi ride, whatever, and I can tell them all about Christ because I may never see them again. But don't send me to my family. But what did Gideon have to do? He had to go to the center of town and tear down the idol that was in the center of town. And he didn't do it by day because he was afraid of his family. So we see Gideon's growth here, right? So Gideon's doing what? God said, you're going to go defeat the Midianites. And then what happened? That was the first step that he gave. He gave him a direction to go. And so Gideon starts to do that step. But does Gideon do that step boldly as a man of valor would? How does he do it? He does it by night, right? He's not quite the man of valor yet. Gideon's not living up to the name that God has given him. He says what? And look in verse 27. He says, and so it was because he feared his father's household and the men of the city. They could not do it by day, that he did it by night. It says, the men of the city arose early in the morning, and behold, the altar of Baal was cast down, and the grove was cut down that was by it. And the second bullock was offered upon the altar that was built. And they said one to another, who had done this thing? And they inquired and asked, and Gideon the son of Joash had done this thing. And the men of the city said unto Joash, bring out thy son, that he may die, because he hath cast down the altar of Baal, and because he hath cut down the grove that was by it. And Joash said unto all that stood against him, will ye plead for Baal? Will ye save him? He that will plead for him, let him be put to death whilst it is yet morning. If he be a god, let him plead for himself, because one hath cast down his altar. Therefore on that day they called him, and he's talking about Gideon, Jerubbaal, saying, let Baal plead against him, because he hath thrown down his altar. So you see, Gideon gets a mighty man of valor name now, because the people in his town now know who Gideon is. Because what did Gideon do? He threw down the altar of Baal. His father actually stood up for Gideon, which I think is interesting. The least in the family, the father stands up for him and says, guess what, Gideon? Go ahead. Let Baal plead for himself. And Gideon gets this new name, this new Jerubbaal. We'll see that reference later on. But we see that he gets his name, that let Baal plead against him because he hath thrown down his altar. And so we see in verse 33, this sets up where the battle that we know that Gideon is going to fight. In verse 33, then all the Midianites and the Amalekites and the children of the east were gathered together and went over and pitched in the valley of Jezreel. But the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, and he blew a trumpet, and Ebenezer was gathered after him. And he sent messengers throughout all Manasseh, and has gathered after him. And he sent messengers unto Asher and to Zebulun and to Naphtali, and they came to meet them. So here we see Gideon, this man who was hiding, threshing wheat, going and doing his first task of tearing down an altar, to now calling the tribes of Israel together to go fight the Midianites and the Midianites and Amalekites. That's what he talks there in verse 34 and 35. We see he blew a trumpet, and all these men started coming together. So the call went out, basically is what happened, and went out to the surrounding tribes. And the surrounding tribes, it says, and they came to meet them. So within a short amount of time, God, because of his faithfulness and because of God developing that faith within him, is showing him that he was going to provide for him and support him and care for him and give him the power he needed to survive. Gideon is now stepping into the role that God knew that he could serve in. And we see, we won't read all through it, but we see that that display of faith, that first display of faith where Gideon stepped out and said, yes, I can do this. We actually see in verse 36, this is the great test of the fleece. If you know this, remember the story of Gideon. Gideon laid out a fleece for God. He says, said unto God in verse 36, if thou wilt save Israel by my hand, as thou hast said, keep that phrase in mind, as thou hast said, behold, I will put a fleece of wool on the floor, and if the dew be on the fleece only, and it be dry upon all the earth beside it, then shall I know that thou wilt save Israel by my hand, as thou hast said. And it was so that for when he rose up early in the morrow and thrust the fleece together and wrung the dew out of the fleece, a bowl full of water. And Gideon said unto God, let not thy anger be hot against me, and I will speak but this once. Let me prove, I pray thee, but this once with the fleece. Let it now be dry only upon the fleece, and upon all the ground let there be dew. And God did it so that night, for it was dry upon the ground only, and there was dew on all the ground. It's interesting, when I read this again, I was studying this, I've missed that little phrase that happened in verse 36 and 37. Because often we read this passage and we read, oh, well, Gideon didn't believe God. Like Gideon didn't believe that God was going to provide. But the test was not about believing God. The test was about Gideon believing his own ability, right? Some have argued that this was actually Gideon trying to get God to change his mind. Maybe I can provoke God enough. He just won't want me to. Maybe if I keep testing God, he'll just go to somebody else. Which in some ways, I don't know Gideon's thoughts in this. But he says there in verse 36 and 37, as thou hast said. He knew that this was the angel of the Lord that came to him, that gave him a message, said, you're going to deliver the Midianites. He knew that. He knew in his heart that this was, or he knew in his mind at least, that this was, God had a plan for him to go and deliver the Midianites. Because he says there, as thou hast said. But it seems to be there was a gap for Gideon in his growth and his faith. That there was a gap between what he knew that God had said and when he believed in his heart that he could do, that God was going to provide. And we see that there's grace that God has given him. This is an exercise in God's grace towards us. How many times do we know God says that we should do something, and we just like, God, I'm just not really sure. But he continues to work on us because he wants to do something through us. That's what we're seeing here in Gideon. He says, God, I know you've said it, and I know you want me to do this. I know you want me to take this step, but God, I'm not sure. I need another sign. I need another miracle. Remember Gideon, when he first met the angel, what did he say? You're the God who did miracles. Where are the miracles? Yeah, that was what Gideon, that's where Gideon's faith was, that's what energized Gideon's faith. And so Gideon was looking for those miracles. God had just protected him from being killed in his own city because he had torn down an idol of Baal. And Gideon still needed those reassurances. Gideon's faith, that we see that grace that God was giving as he was developing that faith. And he was displaying that faith. So we see that God did did what Gideon had asked and showed him the miracle of the fleece. And we see that in verse 7, then Jerubbaal, who was Gideon, that name, again, his man of valor named Jerubbaal, and all the people that were with him rose up early and pitched beside the well of Haradon, so that the host of the Midianites were on the north side of them by the hill of Moriah in the valley. And the Lord said unto Gideon, the people that are with thee are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel vaunt themselves against me, saying, mine own my own hand hath saved me. So here we know this story as well. We've heard the story as well, where the people have come together and from the surrounding nations of Israel, and have come to Gideon, and they've camped there. And the Lord comes to Gideon in a dream and says, "You've got too many." He says, I told you I'm going to lead this battle. I told you you're my man of valor. You're going to do this in my power. And he says, I don't want you. You've got too many, because if you do and you go defeat the Midianites with what you've got, you're going to say you did it on your own power. And so God wants to show himself forth and show his glory through this. So he goes and he says, if you're afraid, go home. And out of that 22,000 that were there, how many were left? About 10,000. So half your people just went. Now the Midianites, how did they describe the Midianites and the Amalekites? How did we describe them in chapter 6? They were what? Like grasshoppers. Like all over the land. More than they could count. They'd run the Israelites out into the mountains and the caves. And it says there that that 22,000 was too many. He's down to 10,000 now. And then God came to him and said, no, you still got too many. You're still going to say it's in your own power. In verse 4, it says, the people are yet too many. Bring them down to the water and let them try them there for the water. And it shall be that of whom I say unto thee, this shall go with thee, the same shall go with thee. Of whomsoever I say unto thee, this shall not go with thee, the same shall not go. So he brought them down to the people into the water, and the Lord said unto Gideon, every one that lappeth the water with his tongue as a dog lappeth, him shalt thou set by himself. Likewise, everyone that boweth down upon his knees. And the number of them that lapped, putting their hands to their mouth, were 3,000 men. But the rest of the people bowed down their knees to drink water. And so we see that, we're 300, or 3,000, we're 300 men, and the rest that bowed down their knees to drink water. So we see that 10,000 now went down to 300. When we think of, and we can spend time on this, and I know there's messages on this about which people are we? Are we the first ones to go? Are we the ones that said, I'm good, I'm in the promised land, but I'm not willing to fight for it, I'm gone? That's the first group. And then the second group we see is a group that, and I've heard it taught and preached different ways. The second group is a group that they were ready to go, but they didn't have the skills, or they didn't have the awareness of what it took to fight. If you go down to a river and you know the enemy is just over the next hill, and you go to fight and you've got your shield and your armor and you need water, do you get down on all fours and drink out of the creek? No, it's not safe. What happens when the enemy attacks? Where are you? Laying on the ground drinking water. And he says these last 300 were aware of the situation they were in. They knew what the situation was. They knew the Midianites and the Amalekites were just over the hill. They knew that they were facing a challenge. And so these men kneeled down, looking around, took their hand down on the water and drank, all the while ready for the attack. When we think about the warnings we're given as Christians, what are we supposed to be looking for? We're supposed to be looking for the devil, walking about as a roaring lion, seeking who he may devour. We as Christians have to be aware. We have to be alert. And so we see that led him down to the 300 men. We see that this was a display of faith for Gideon, because Gideon was told he was a man of valor and he was going to lead the people against the Midianites. But God didn't give him those kind of details. He didn't say, you're going to lead the people against the Midianites and you're going to have 300 people to do it with. He didn't say, you're going to lead the people against the Midianites and you're going to, over 21,000 people are going to come and they're going to go away and not fight with you. What did God promise him at the very beginning? He says, you're a man of valor. You're going to lead against the Midianites. And he told him one thing: you won't die. Imagine that kind of promise. He didn't promise him riches and wealth or anything else. He promised him what? Life. That was it. He didn't say you're going to have an easy road to get there. He didn't say the fight against the Midianites is you're just going to walk up and the Midianites are going to lay down their arms and surrender. And so this is the faith that we've seen that Gideon has developed, and we've seen that grace that God has given him to develop that obedience in taking the next step. We see that there's grace for a faithful man. Look at verse 16. So we know that the battle happened. The 300 men surrounded the Midianites. They had the pitchers and the lamps, and they yelled for the army of the Lord and Gideon, and they crashed their pots and scared the Midianites, and the Midianites attacked each other. And then they fled, and then the Israelites came in and attacked, and so they followed them. And then we'll skip down in verse 16. He follows the plan. He said God had given him this plan. He says, and he divided the 300 men into 3 companies, and he put a trumpet in every man's hand, and empty pitchers and lamps within the pitchers. And he said unto them, look on me and do likewise. And behold, when I come to the outside of the camp, it shall be as I do, so shall ye do. When I blow the trumpet and all that are with me, then blow ye the trumpet also on every side of the camp, and say, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. And so then they did this, and the 3 companies blew the trumpets down in verse 20 and brake the pitchers and held the trumpets in their hands, the trumpets in their right hands, and blew withal, and they cried, the sword of the Lord and Gideon. And they stood every man in his place round about the camp, and all the host ran, cried, and fled. Then 300 blew at the trumpet, and the Lord and every man's sword against his fellow, even through all the hosts. And the hosts fled. I won't name all the names, but they fled further down south, down the Jordan River. And we see that plan that God had given him, that Gideon had used, that God blessed that plan. God allowed him to defeat the Midianites. There was grace that God had given to this man for his faithfulness, in carrying through, that his plan was successful. The goal, the thing that God had said that he was going to do, he performed and did it. And we see that it wasn't just, okay, we ran them out of Israel, let's go, or they're out of our country. We see that God gave him also a complete victory. Look down in Judges chapter 4. It says, and Gideon came to Jordan and passed over, and the 300 men that were with him faint, yet pursuing them. And so there's a longer story here we won't get into today, but the men of Gideon, those 300 men, came all the way down to Jordan. They followed down the river Jordan, and as the Midianites crossed over, they crossed over to follow them and continued to pursue them. And it says, and the men that were with him faint, yet pursuing them. We talk about a complete victory. God never promised Gideon that he was going to have an easy victory. God never promised him that his victory was just going to, again, he was just going to show up and the Midianites were going to say, yep, sorry guys, y'all are our cousins, we're going to get out of here. We were just stopping by to visit. That's not what God promised. God promised that he wouldn't die. And so Gideon took that and his 300 men to the very limits. He says there, the 300 men that were with him, they did what? They were faint, but they kept pursuing. So we think about the race that God has given us as Christians. What is he asking us to do? Be faithful. He asks us to continue to run. He doesn't say stop running when you get that one success. He says continue to run, continue to grow, continue to push yourself. Because where does our strength come from? It comes from God. And so if we want to see that complete victory, we have to continue to run. We can't be comfortable just saying, oh, got that one victory. Oh, showed up to church today. That's my small victory for today. My small victory of faith. No, we got to continue to serve. We got to continue to run. Even though we may be faint, even though we may be outnumbered, even though at any time those Midianites could have turned around and said, oh, there's only 300 of y'all. Oh, we can take y'all. They didn't know that. They continued to pursue them, knowing that God was going to protect them. They had the faith that God was going to protect them. So as believers, we need, God will give us the grace when we're humble. God will give us the grace when we're, He will give us grace when we're obedient, and He will give us grace when we're faithful. We saw with the Israelites. What did the Israelites do after peace with Gideon, or under Gideon? What happened to them? They stopped being obedient again. And guess what? They saw persecution again. And so God gives us grace when we're humble, when we're obedient, and when we're faithful. But when we fall out of that, when we don't choose obedience, or we're not humble, or we're not faithful, what's going to happen? We're going to get chastised as believers. And so Gideon showed that faith. Gideon showed that humility. He showed that obedience. And we see, actually, if you go down to verse 33 of chapter 8. And it came to pass, as soon as Gideon was dead, that the children... go back to verse 29. And Jerubbaal the son of Joash went and dwelt in his own house, and Gideon had 70 sons of his own body begotten, and he had many wives, and his concubines, and she bare a son, skipping down to verse 32. And Gideon the son of Joash died a good old age, and was buried in the sepulchre of Joash his father in Ophrah of the Abazarites. In verse 28, that's what I was looking for. And thus was Midian subdued before the children of Israel, so that they lifted up their heads no more. And the country was in quietness for 40 years in the days of Gideon. So this contest between Midian and Israel, under the direction of God through Gideon, was finally subdued, it says. And that they lifted up their heads no more. And the country was in quietness for 40 years in the days of Gideon. And so that through a man who was being faithful, threshing wheat in a winepress, God used him to do something mighty and create 40 years of peace in the land of Israel. And we see in verse 33 the result of that peace. It says, and it came to pass, as soon as Gideon was dead, that the children of Israel turned again and went whoring after Balaam and Baal-berith their god. And the children of Israel remembered not the Lord their God, which had delivered them out of the hands of all their enemies, neither showed them kindness on every side, neither showed them kindness of the house of Jerubbaal, namely Gideon, according to all the goodness which he had shown unto Israel. God had promised Gideon what? He would protect him and he wouldn't die. And when Gideon died, what did Israel do? Turned again. So as believers, we need to make sure that that we are living the life, the Gideon life. That God will, and we see that God respects those that have faith, and that Gideon had a heart for God. Right? Gideon wanted to see God's miracles. Gideon wanted to see God deliver His people, but Gideon needed to work out his faith. We've seen that passage before in the New Testament. It says, "Work out your faith with patience." That's what Gideon was doing. Gideon knew he had holes in his faith, and he needed God to help him work through that. And so we see that God gives us the grace to do that. He gives us the grace when we come to Him with a heart that really wants to see Him work. And so we'll be looking next week at the grace to stand, and looking at Daniel. So if you want to read ahead and read through the book of Daniel and the story of Daniel, we'll be looking at him next week. Any questions? Sorry I don't have the visuals today, but we'll do better for next week. Any questions? All right, well, let's close.